Today's talk is quite difficult, again, like yesterday or the day before when we recorded the preceding lecture. It's difficult because it's all about, I'm calling it cultural assault. I haven't seen that used before, but it's when the colonial settler culture actually fights you, and they fight you through their laws and through the institutions they create in response to Native people's presence. They don't take Native people's presence as a given. They see us almost as an intrusion on their world because they have very shallow memories. Some people might call it amnesia, because they very conveniently forget the things that contradict the way they want things to be. Some people live their entire life in amnesia because of the stress that came to them when they were children, or the exigencies of adult life they can't take, and so they go into amnesia. We call it today drug addiction. It's a form of amnesia where you take drugs that put you in a euphoria that makes the real world unimportant. But you find yourself, you're not even in the world anymore, and you can't engage with it, and so in a sense you just want to die. That is a summary of cultural addiction and our present drug addictions, and they're all related. They're all related. Like when we come out of our cultural assault, we will be healed as a society without these terrible, haunting kinds of habits. So I'm going to try to take the high ground, of course, because I can, and look at it kind of from above, objectively, and say, what happened? Simple as that. I'm showing you this because this is a contemporary piece of silver produced at Six Nations. I'm sorry, I don't know the artist, but on it, it's a beautiful silver chalice, very similar to a communion cup like the one that Queen Anne gave us 400 years ago. But this one has a tree of peace up the side. It's a pine tree. And the tip of it hits just the edge of the cup. Then it comes down into a tree trunk, and then into roots, and then into a beautiful banner that's referring to the great law of peace. This is a cup to honor the great law. The great law took us out of cultural trauma of the men and brought us into a good mind. We lived that way for 1,000 years. And in it is architecture. It's called the long house. That's what we were instructed to live in, and that's how we lived, and that's how we loved to live. Here you see a silversmith at work. He doesn't have an elaborate jewelry shop. He works just outside a long house. Or, yes, it's maybe his own house. It's just covered in tar paper. Doesn't matter. He puts out his table, he gets out his tools, and he goes to work just sitting out in nature. This is so beautiful. This is the nature of our people. Simple and unpretentious, and doing what they have to do. And a lot of the people at the Six Nations community are world famous artists. I find it shocking, but we produce silver that's collected in museums all over the world, but we also produce ceremonial materials, masks and things that are collected. We do ceremonial pipes. We have people who make pipes, and the pipes are used in ceremonies in Europe because when they bring out a native pipe to negotiations in Europe, it symbolizes something about a relationship that they never forget in Europe. We forget it very easily here, but Europeans have a very easy time remembering history. And they love it, actually. They love the native culture in North America in a way that no settler here really does. Now, I have to go through a lot of reports and legislation right now, just to give you an overview of how profound our connections are to authorities having jurisdiction, because they change. The first one is the Royal Proclamation of 1767. Now, this is before we came up to Six Nations. And this is before the American Revolution. It was issued by George III, and he did it on behalf of the Indians of North America, if you can believe it. What the proclamation said is that the American colonies have a border, and they are not to go west of that border. And everything west of that border is Indian territory, including our own territory in New York State, which he had the map labeled Territory of the Six Nations. We have that map. I don't know whether I have it here. I don't see it. No. But that was so honoring. We knew when that proclamation came down that maybe we were safe. Now, in a previous lecture, I talked about what happened after 1767, basically 1776, the American Revolution, 1784, when we sought refuge in Canada, again, by the grace of George III, because Joseph Brant went to England when we were losing to the Americans and they were basically genociding us. He took the trip to London and wanted to have a hearing with George III, and his good friend Hugh Percy arranged it. And Brant was there for 6 months. He was a great celebrity in London. At that time, the Victorians loved Indians. And he was invited to every important party in that city for 6 months, and he got quite annoyed because he was there on a mission. And finally, he said he wasn't getting this audience. He did this very psychodramatic thing. He bought a war tomahawk. He cut his hair and put it in the warrior's kind of style with a crop of hair at the back with a feather hanging from it, and put on his Indian clothes and went to George's house to get a hearing. And he had a lot of courtiers around him protecting him, and Brant went into the reception room that had a beautiful Georgian mahogany reception table and thrust his hatchet right into the middle of the table, and it stood there vibrating. He saw George within an hour. He knew what he had to do, and what he did, he asked George to help us find a refuge in Canada. Upper Canada it was called at the time. Montreal was Lower Canada. Seems strange because it's oriented to the St. Lawrence River. So that's why we're called Upper Canada here. And that's when he went. George went to his agent in Montreal, the agent for all of North American Indians. His name was Frederick Haldeman. He had never met any of us, but the instruction he was given was to give the Six Nations the Grand River. It was a huge thing. Brant knew the Grand River because he traveled back and forth between Detroit and Montreal many times. He didn't really know what to think of it, but Haldeman's proclamation, which is not a treaty, has baffled legal minds for years. Because, yes, it's a gift to us, and it's a land grant from George III, but it doesn't have any legal status in Canada, which the lawyers love, because that means that we don't have to surrender that land to those people at Six Nations. It is such a valuable piece of land, and we want our cities of Galt and Waterloo and, Dunnville and whatever, we want them to stay and not be threatened by this land grab. They maybe thought it was a land grab, but Haldeman was very clear. His edict is very, very simple. It says, whereas His Majesty, having been pleased to direct that in consideration of the early attachment to his cause, manifested by the Mohawk Indians, in other words, we were his allies, and the loss of their own settlement in New York State, which they thereby sustained, that a convenient tract of land under his protection, the king's protection, should be chosen as a safe and comfortable retreat for them and others of the Six Nations who have lost their settlements, which means all the other nations, within the territory of the American states. Remembering, this Haldeman Treaty is 1784, 85, and so the territory of the American states. He didn't say the United States of America. He called it a territory because for George III, it was still disputed territory. And I have, at the earnest desire of many of these His Majesty's allies, purchased a tract of land from Indians situated between Lake Ontario, Erie, and Huron, who are the Mississaugas. They came into this territory after we left, and they were here when this agreement was made. And in His Majesty's name, I authorize and permit the said Mohawk Nation and such others of the Six Nations as wish to settle in that quarter, to take possession of and settle upon the banks of the river called Ouse, or the Grand River, running into Lake Ontario, allotting to them for that purpose 6 miles deep from each side of the river, beginning at Lake Erie and extending into the portion to the head of the said river, with them and their posterity to enjoy forever. Sorry about the emphasis, but I mean, it's very clear. The land is given to us forever. It doesn't mean that because political things changed that we would lose our land. No, it was given to us by the British Crown forever. It's pretty explicit. And then given under my hand at the Castle of St. Louis in Quebec, the 25th day of October, 1784, in the 25th year of the reign of our sovereign Lord, George III, by the grace of God of Great Britain, France, and Ireland, King, Defender of the Faith, and so forth. Friedrich Haldeman. So, when we had that agreement, and we did have a copy of it with the seal of Haldeman on it, and it does exist, but it seems to float around and people lose track of it, because at Six Nations we don't have a big archive. What we have are people's closets, and that's where a lot of our artifacts and treaties are kept, in people's houses. And they're not just in one house, they're in lots of houses. But it does exist. And fortunately, that wording has survived the document. So we understood ourselves as a sovereign people with a land base granted to us by the British Crown. That's pretty big authority for your presence. Give it to the Mohawks and other of the Six Nations who want to come with them. And most of the people who came up were from Six Nations, including my own relatives who were members of the lower Mohawks near Albany. They came, and there were 1,500, and I know my relations are in it because my band number at the reserve is quite low. So that means that we're among the first families. So no, I guess I'm proud of it. Now, there's a lot fomenting in Canada at that time. This Silver Covenant chain and the two Royal Wampum are still intact. But now they're going to be betrayed through a political circumstance that has to do with the founding of the country of Canada. There was a move afoot to found a sovereign country separate from the British Crown, still ruled by the British Crown. That is called Canada. And white members of all the provinces got together and formed an agreement. And I think that agreement is called the British North American Act. But it's the legislation that created Canada. In this legislation, they left out Native people completely. And because they left us out and didn't mention particularly the Six Nations, who were proud allies of the British Crown, we took that as a betrayal of the Silver Covenant train in two Royal Wampum, one that has never healed since. And this is unfortunate. I mean, I don't know whether we can bring it back, but I certainly hope so. And I certainly hope there are members of this class who might be a part of it. In 1876, Canada produced a piece of legislation without consulting us. It's called the Indian Act of Canada, 1876. And what it did, it put in Native people on territorial reserves, which they couldn't leave. They were confined. It was a forced confinement, very much like what the Americans did and we did with the Japanese and the Germans during World War II. They were put in camps, but these camps were permanent territorial reserves. And a lot of people in Six Nations are so offended by that word reserve, because to us, a reserve is where you put animals. And we say, we are not animals. We are on a territory, not a reserve. And this took another 100 years or more for Canada to change its mind and not call us people confined to a reserve. But we know it was a confined reserve because we couldn't leave the reserve without getting a note from the Indian agent who lived on the reserve, right near the entrance to the reserve. We had to get a pass to leave, even to go shopping, in Cambridge or Galt. We couldn't leave without permission. What do you think that's like, living on a piece of land that you're confined to? It does something to you psychically. And the assault continues. Now, this is the Cayuga chief, Descahe, Levi General. In 1920, Levi, with the support and agreement of his nation, decided to go to the newly formed League of Nations in Europe. And what he was going to do was make a case for the absolute and complete sovereignty of the Six Nations of the Grand River, and to be accepted in the League as a voting member. In other words, as a country. This was a very daring move, and he was received with great fanfare in Europe, and they did vote. Of course, we know the League of Nations went out of existence a few years later, but they did vote to accept us as a legal entity in the League. This was a huge step. Let me tell you, the Canadian government was furious because it was done without them. And the American government, too, they were quite threatened. Now, he went over to Europe via Buffalo, New York, because he had family and friends there. He could stay there, and then, he would come back to Six Nations. But on his return, the Canadian customs would not allow him to come back into the country. They considered him a political traitor. But a traitor of what? Not of his own people, who were so proud of him, but of, quote, the government of Canada. Such an insult. And poor Descahe, because he's a Cayuga, he's a very gentle man. He died in Buffalo, never able to go home again. They never lifted that banning of him. And so we honor him. Here is the League of Nations. And here is a stone we raised at Six Nations to honor Descahe. He is one of our cultural heroes. Yet who has heard of Descahe? Now, this is a picture I showed at the last lecture. It is the Six Nations Council meeting together, in this case in 1898, but I show it to you for a very good reason. The Indian Act took away, the Indian Act created a form of government for Native people that was like the elected council of a small town, called the Band Council. And we didn't agree with it because our chiefs were chosen by clan mothers for 1,000 years. We had a spiritual democracy where the leaders evolved out of the good ways of the families and clan mothers who would identify men who were wise enough to be placed with a title in the council. So these men you see here are all chosen like in an hereditary monarchy. They're chosen to be the chiefs, just like George III is chosen. We understood this choosing the chiefs, not electing. We never had elections. Even the Ganawida never mentioned an election to raise people to different offices. They were selected by nature and by natural selection. And this is called a spiritual democracy. And they don't exist anywhere on the planet today, or very rarely, because those kinds of processes, spiritual processes, are not deemed valid. Why not? Why wouldn't they be? And why wouldn't this be a good way to choose people? At any rate, the Indian Act was being enforced more strongly every year. Remembering 1876, now we're coming to the year 1924. The Indian agent for Canada, his name is Douglas Campbell Scott. He's a civil servant, but he was given the job to go to Indian reserves, native reserves, and force them to have an election by the laws of Canada. Well, we thought that was malarkey, and we had no respect for him. Now, Douglas Campbell Scott is a contradictory person, because in the sense he's the penultimate colonizer. But on the other hand, he's a romantic poet. He's well known for his poetry. And his poetry is actually quite beautiful and even includes Native people in it. So he sees Native people as the exotic other. But he has no problem following the law and forcing the elections, very much like the Nazis did. They just came in and forced people to do things to warp their presence in the colors of the colonizer. I mean, it's a terrible process. But what happened, because the Six Nations resisted having a voluntary election, the RCMP came in on October 14th, 1924, to this council house and into this room with guns. Stood at the front of the room like protesters and raised their guns and said, "You are having an election. The election will be held in 3 days. That's all we're giving you." Well, how are people supposed to have time to campaign, to select the people who are going to run? There is no time. We can't do that. He says, "You're going to do that because it's the law. And we're going to gather up all the wampums you people are carrying in this room right now at gunpoint." So they collected all the wampum belts. Then they carted them off to Toronto and gave them to the Royal Ontario Museum, who has some of them still today. They thought, well, these Indians think wampum's powerful, we're going to take it away from them. They knew what they were doing. I'll tell you, our people were traumatized. And they did have the election in 3 days, but you know what? Of all of our people, maybe 30 people voted in the election. That's all. And because some of those people were stood up for office and were members of the same family, almost the entire band council was a little family affair, and it wasn't democratic at all. But that's what we have today. We have 2 councils today because of this date, which is a day of infamy in Iroquoian culture. October 14th, 1924. Who could name that date? Even, in the non-native population. No one. But I'll tell you, the elders I studied with said, never forget that date, Bill. Never. I mean, they were so clear. So I'm not forgetting it right now. And I'm also remembering how horrible it was. Gunpoint, steal the wampum, tell these old men with old titles to get lost. How could they disrupt the culture of 1,000 years old in the name of some modern idea of election? We still have elections at Six Nations. We still have a band council. But the situation has never changed. The last election, only 300 of 22,000 voted. And when you work for the band council, the way the government works it, they give all of the funds to support Native people to the band council to distribute. So this small group of people are in charge of huge amounts of money, like millions. They might say, oh, we're giving the Six Nations this year, we're giving them $30 million. We're giving it to the band council, they can do what they want with it, but they've got to take care of the roads, we have a police department, we have all this stuff. But it's paid for by the Canadian government through the band council. So there's a huge rift at Six Nations. I've worked with the band council myself to see how they really operate. I was roundly criticized by the traditional chiefs. Don't work for them, Bill, but go and check it out. Go and check it out. See if it's not like we tell you. And it was exactly like they told me. They're very small-minded. Okay. The other thing they did to us after 1924, they started banning every Native ceremony and the use of Native language. Can you imagine? You can't speak your language and you can't have your ceremonies. So our ceremonies went into people's houses and they were practiced in secret. And they became the secret knowledge of the Six Nations. But it's not secret anymore because now it's come out. but they were secret because we had to hide it. We're a little bit like Anne Frank sitting up in a garret, living a fantasy life, knowing that we're in the presence of our own oppressor, who could any moment take everything away from us. And of course they took her life. And they've taken our life too in many ways. But one of the most important ceremonies of Six Nations was the last one we were able to practice, 1933, burning of the white dog. And I was told by the elders, when that ceremony comes back, we'll know that our culture is safe once again. But what is the burning of the white dog? It's a remnant of what some people might call a primitive practice. It was the sacrifice of a white dog during the midwinter ceremonies to remind us of the nature of letting go and of death. And what they would do, we had dogs in Six Nations. Very rarely were they born white, but some were. They were albino, and those were considered dogs who were candidates for the ceremony held once a year. The white dog was a dog that was loved by everybody. I mean, this wasn't just some loser of a dog. This was the dog people loved, and the owners loved him. But they say we have to sacrifice him tonight. And the ceremony, I'm going to describe it to you because they did photograph it once. It's quite a visceral ceremony, and people with weak stomachs always are offended, including Native people, but I'm not, because I know what the ceremony was about. And I myself had to give up my dog when she died. And I thought of the white dog ceremony, because what they do, they gently strangle the dog. Just wrap their hands around the neck and choke it. So it dies a very gentle death. Now, that's outside the longhouse. Then they take the body and they decorate it with feathers. With ribbons, rather, around all the paws and around the tail and around the neck. So the feathers move. Then 4 men pick the body of the dog up and walk it in the longhouse like it's alive. And the ribbons are moving, and, people are crying. And then they put the dog in the bench in the middle of the longhouse, that longhouse I showed you at Sour Springs. And they lay him on his side, and then they do the songs of the sacrifice of the white dog. Then when they're done, they bring the dog outside, and they have a big barrel with a fire in it, and they put his body in there and cremate him. And the smoke that goes up is our offering. It's usually a white smoke. Burning of the white dog. Illegal. If you ever do that again, you're going to be, I don't know what they do to punish Native people, but they stopped it, of course. They were intimidated by the Indian agent. Who is this Indian agent? Some white guy telling us we can't do our ancient ceremony? What is this? It's like, Jews who weren't allowed to practice their religion during the Nazi era. Why are they taking it away from it? Our religion is so old. It's the Jews speaking there, but it's also us. Because it's a very similar relationship going on there. When you talk about deconstructing a culture, which is what the Canadian government was trying to do. They had a law. It referred to changing the Indians and making them more like white people. I've forgotten the name of the law. The Indian Repatriation Act or something of that sort. There are many laws happening. I'm just hitting on a few. Because now we have to look at the concurrent residential school narrative. We had several things going on at once. This is a copy of the Indian Act as it's issued just a few years ago. It's still in force. And Native people all over Canada have been trying to get rid of it, but look at it. Indian Act. Indian. The office consolidation. Wow. When I hold this in my hand, I mean, if we were having a live class, I'd bring in a copy and just let you handle it as it goes around the room. Just to see, this is the mechanism of colonization. So blatant, it's a blatantly racist document. And yet it's done in the name of our lovely country, Canada. When you think about Pauline Johnson, how much she loved Canada in her poetry, you think of the Six Nations who tried so hard to form friendships with members of the British Crown and British settlers whom we loved. And then we have this act coming out of Ottawa. And it covers the entire country, east to west, filled with maybe 600 different nations who all have different customs and different histories, blanketed into one simple word. How would the British like to be called? Oh, you Europeans. Or even, whatever else they might call them. That erases the distinction between England, France, and Norway, and Holland, and just turns them into one thing, and then just says we want to get rid of them. They couldn't even imagine anything like that happening, but they were doing it here in North America, and doing it quite happily, I must say. Okay, here I say it was a 7-day notice. I've heard 3 days. But this must be correct because this is my researched slide. The sacred wampum seized at gunpoint, taken to the Royal Ontario Museum in Toronto. Right near here. This is all being played out in a dramatic moment. It's our setting here. It's in the ground here. And then this is the hereditary chiefs in 1924, just before they took them out of office. And one of my relatives is here, Elliot. He, I don't know which one it is, George Eliot. But this George Eliot, yes, he was an hereditary chief, but he also went to the University of Guelph and got a horticulture degree. That's what our people are like. I mean, they love horticulture, of course, and George was very interested in it, wanted to bring the knowledge back to Six Nations. So he went to the University of Guelph. We have many stories of our people going on to university educations, even at this time. And there is our council house at that time. And in front are dignitaries. This is a visit of one of the royal family, one of the sons of Queen Victoria. And it's a big gathering outside our council. This is what our council house used to look like when it was alive, and people used it all the time. Now it's abandoned pretty well. And we have beautiful offices for the band council done in the 1960s modernism style. And here is a picture of the last burning of the white dog. And this is all we got, was the shadow of the smoke. And they consider this a spirit photograph. And we became agrarian. And at the residential school, they taught the children farming. Here they are, a group of Six Nations kids. They're like farmers of the 1930s. when this was taken, and they love farming. It was really the hallmark of Six Nations. We were very astute farmers. We used to have a a fall fair attended by people from all over southern Ontario to learn our farming techniques. And then here we have the very first residential school in Canada, the Mohawk Institute. This is not the building we have today. This one burnt down, as well as a number of other buildings around it. The fires were started by young people who hated these schools. They burnt them down. Then they built this. They built this one of brick, not wood. And that was built in 1904. It still stands today. You can see the automobiles are from the 1930s. This is how it looked. See the windows all open because it's not air conditioned, as nothing was air conditioned at the time. And here's a picture of the kids gathered together in assembly. There were up to 150, 160 kids that went through here at any one time. Most of the teachers were non-natives. There was one teacher, a very famous teacher, who was native. But a lot of these teachers hated native people. You can see how they dressed the children in European type clothes. The boys on one side, the girls on another, which is the way they did schools in those days. They separated. And this is, I don't have her name, but she was one of the teachers there at the Mohawk Institute. And here are the children gathered outside the front door of the Mohawk Chapel because the children were required to go to the Anglican Chapel every morning to sing and pray before they started their classes. And they're in their uniforms. And of course, the chaplain of the St. Paul's Chapel of the Mohawks, he was a white man. And they were white men right till the end. When they closed the school in 1970, the Reverend Zimmerman, who was hated at Six Nations, he had to leave. He had a house there. He stayed the chaplain of St. Paul's right to the end. Here is the dormitory where the children slept, with screens separating the beds. And then the headmistress would come in and tell everybody to go to sleep, turn the lights out. My grandfather slept in the rooms like this, and when he was 16, he ran away. He tied sheets together and went down a second floor window in the washroom, got to the ground, and just kept walking. He never wanted to go back here again. And you know, he walked from there to Detroit all by himself with no money, a young man of 16. Can you imagine? They had truant officers in those days, so there was someone looking out for him the whole way as he walked across Ontario and came to Detroit, because when he crossed the border, they couldn't take him back anymore. Wow. And you know, I'm a grandson. He's telling me these stories. I'm going, gee, Grandpa, residential school. I don't get it. You know, this is my grandpa at the top, 1909, and there is the window circled. Because he took me here and said, "That's the window I crawled out of, Bill, to escape this place." This is the back of the building you saw earlier, still there. And then, what do? This is my Indian status card. They give you a card, and the card has a number on it, and you are forever numbered in a way that no other Canadian is. This is not a social insurance number. This is a native status card. And see, my band number is 662. That's very early in the history. My name, they gave me Lawinokwas, William Vernon Woodworth. And there's this number. And today, we have a more modern card. It has a second number on the back. See, I'm Lower Mohawk, Six Nations of the Grand River. No other Canadian has to carry a card like this. This is the kind of identification you had to have when you were a Jew in Nazi Germany. Where are your papers? You know, on one hand you're proud of it, on the other hand you're not, because it has certain advantages, being a native. Tax advantages, I would say. If you live and work on the reserve, you don't pay income taxes, and the government is obliged to take care of all of your health care costs. And they're very generous. So a lot of things are taken care of. They like to keep it that way so that you will continue to accept the Indian Act. Because if they take that away, you're going to have your rights taken away from you. Okay. Now, we come to an incredible moment, what we call a flashpoint, a cultural flashpoint, which means something happens in the culture that triggers a tremendous response among the people. It's a little bit, we just had, you know, in Gay Pride, the Stonewall riots were commemorated. What happened in that was 1969. They raided the gay bar, and the gay people in it resisted the police and objected. And for the first time, gay people declared who they were, and they weren't going to put up with this oppression. That was the beginning, because the next few months, they had the first Gay Pride Parade. That's how important these flashpoints are. Well, we've had a number of them at Six Nations, but none greater than the Oka crisis of 1990. Now, what happened in Oka, Quebec? There is the Mohawk Reserve Ganasatake and Ganawage. This is Ganasatake. It's in the town of Oka. It's a Jesuit town. They're very famous for their cheese, right? Oka cheese. But the people in that town decided they wanted to build a new golf course. And they chose a piece of land that was well known as an Indian burial ground. But they didn't care. They said, that's a beautiful piece of land, that's going to be our golf course. Well, the people of Ganasatake weren't going to put up with that. That's ridiculous. I mean, you Quebecers want to build a golf course on our burial ground when you've got all this other land? What is wrong with you? They said, we're going to do it because we can. We're the colonizer, you're the Indian. Get off the land. So literally kicking the Mohawks of Ganasatake, or Ganawage, off that land. Well, we didn't put up with it this time. The Mohawk warriors got together, they put on face bands, they brought out weapons, because the Canadian government brought in the Canadian military to get us off that land. And they brought guns. So we had two sides with guns. And of course, here's what happens. One of our men got killed in a crossfire, Dudley George. And that was the end. You're coming onto our land and then killing us so you can build a golf course on it? This is nuts. And they stayed on that land for months, as they did here in Caledonia a few years ago, because some developer wanted to put up monster houses on land close to Six Nations. We didn't want anything to do with it, so we took the land over. And that lasted a while. That was another flashpoint. But this flashpoint was huge, because there was killing involved, and guns on both sides. So, you know, we have films and we have pictures of Canadian military and our Mohawk warriors facing each other face to face with guns. This is not a dream. This is truth. And it's pretty damn ugly after all we've been through. I mean, they've taken our wampum, they've got rid of our ceremonies, they put our children in a school where they can't speak their language. What more are you going to do to us? Will we survive? Let's put it this way, the Jews survived the Holocaust. We will survive this, because the human race is very resilient. And you know, I want you to stay with me on this, because I want to be compassionate toward each other, all of us, some who carried this out, some who were the victims of it. Let's have compassion for them, because they were part of a narrative of history. They were swept up in it, and many times didn't really understand what they were doing. But the time has come for us to understand it. This is the incredible thing about our moment, and why looking at this course is so essential to being in this moment. The government, in response, decided to have a royal commission, which they always do. But these royal commissions, they take forever. But it did kind of calm people down. So they commissioned the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples in 1996. It took 4 years, 1992 to 1996. It's 5 volumes, 4,000 pages, and it's an absolutely beautiful conveyance of the culture and situation of Native people all across the country, written by a lot of Native people and all of the leading authorities around Native culture. I read it. It's on the internet. I might ask you to go and take a look at it. I wouldn't ask you to read it. It's 5 volumes. And it's very deep reading, but it is stunningly compassionate. When it came out, I just said, thank God. What? But, Harper was the prime minister at the time. And, whether you know it or not, Harper did not like Native people. But he couldn't say it. But he shelved that report. It never, ever reached the level of being read by government officials. No one ever read it. No one ever responded to it. It's kind of interesting, because when it came time to apologize for the residential schools in Ottawa, guess who had to deliver the apology? Harper. And Harper has no empathy for Native people whatsoever. And so when he's delivering the apology, it is completely heartless. Absolutely heartless. It's horrifying when I watch it, on the internet. So this is not an apology, for gosh sake. Besides, what's an apology? You have to act. We're talking about atonement. Atonement is a spiritual term. It's when you are sorry, but you show it by an action, not by a word. And they didn't understand this. Okay. The Silver Covenant Chain friendship does survive at Six Nations. Let me tell you how. Every year on May 24th, the birthday of Queen Victoria, we have what's called Bread and Cheese Day. And we come from all around, all of the Six Nations communities all around Lake Ontario. They all come to Six Nations, to the community hall, and they have huge loaves of fresh bread and big rounds of cheese. The cheese came from England originally. Queen Victoria sent it over for this day. And so you can go. You can go this year. No, you can't go this year. I'm sure they canceled it because of COVID, but you go and get a big slice of fresh bread and a big slice of cheese and take it home. That is the gift from Victoria. And what it does, it honors the Royal Proclamation of 1767 and of our sovereignty as a nation within Canada. There's nothing to do with Canada, Bread and Cheese Day. And I've already described to you the gifts of Queen Elizabeth II and of her father. Her father gave the coat of arms to the Mohawk Chapel, and Queen Elizabeth gave silver handbells there. It's stunning. And today, the Longhouse traditions and ceremonies have been revived only in the last 25 years. And they're celebrated now in the Longhouses. And the Confederacy Council continues to meet, but without a budget, and they meet separately and in a true Longhouse. They meet once a month. When I began working with archaeologists, I was called into that traditional Longhouse. Oh, Bill, come and speak to us about why you're working with archaeologists. I think I described this to you, and I said, this is scary because, maybe they're going to say, no, stop, because they could. And I would respect it, of course. But what I did, I went as an architect, and I talked about the Longhouse, and I talked about the beautiful shadows in the ground, and how it filled me with great pride of how our ancestors built, just like the Ganawida told us to build, and we were still doing it. There's the evidence in the ground, and the archaeologists are recording it. So it won't be lost, because the colonizer digs the ground up all the time to make a development, like Myers Road that I described to you in a couple of lectures ago. After they're finished looking at the ground and recording it, and it's a beautiful village, it has a beautiful story, they dug the whole thing up. There is no evidence today. I don't think they even put up a sign to say there was a village here. I don't think so. I've never seen it. I've been over there. I'm very concerned, naturally. It's close to the architecture school, and it's close to my heart, and I've taken my students over there and described things to them, and they know that this is a beautiful site for a village. Wow. Wow. Now look what they're building. That's what I want you to say to yourself, because we can't continue like this. Okay. The last part. This is amazing. When it started to come out, the abuse at the residential schools, and people started telling their stories, and they were pretty awful. I mean, without going into detail. Some students had a very good experience, but some had an awful experience, and my grandfather would never talk about the details. But when we talk about sexual abuse, which is rampant today, I mean, adults are abusing children sexually all over the world. It's never been as rampant as it is today. And why is it happening? Why would we do that to the children? Because we have no respect for them. And they're very cute and they're very sexual when they're young, I guess. I don't know. They just say, I'm bored, I'm a teacher here, there's nothing to do this evening. I'll invite this little boy or little girl up to come and talk to me, and then I'll touch them. I'm being very light about this. But they would have intercourse with the little children, and the children would become pregnant, and they go, oh no, we have to abort. So they would do illegal abortions in these little children, which was horrible. I mean, it's bad enough a woman who is in a very good place having an abortion. It's very traumatizing. But when you're a little child, and a lot of times the children would die in the abortion, because abortion is a very delicate and potentially life-threatening process. So then the children would come with these stories, oh, so-and-so touched me, or I had a baby, or sometimes the babies were born. And because they were taken away from their parents, the children had no one to tell except each other. This is my baby. I said, yes, but you're only 12 years old. It's not right. I mean, I'm just recreating the conversations the children may have had. I don't know. But at any rate, when this all started coming out and they started recording it, we realized that there was a terrible legacy there. What we did, and if we had field trips, I'd take you to the site of the residential school and into the woods to show you where they have found the bones of children buried there in anonymous graves. I was horrified. I mean, I have respect for archaeologists. We sent the archaeologists there. And by the way, I had to defend myself in front of the Confederacy chiefs. They now have observers at archaeological sites, and they have respect for archaeologists, principally because of my experience. I was the only one at Six Nations working with archaeologists. I did it out of my architectural instinct, my love of architecture, my love of the Longhouse, my love of all architecture. And it got me in trouble. Well, they finally decided to form a commission called Truth and Reconciliation. Oh, astounding, because they don't have one in the U.S. They have one in South Africa, and they have one in Australia. Those are the only ones. And us now. What is truth? What is reconciliation? Huge words. But this report, it's now on the internet, is absolutely beautiful. Some of it's written by people I know very well, like my friend Brian Rice from Montreal. He wrote the introduction. He's a teacher at University of Manitoba, Winnipeg. And the Truth and Reconciliation records are all kept in Winnipeg today because there were volumes of testimony. Some of it unbelievable, not fit for the average person to read. Reconciliation. Reconciliation means that you're going to recover a good relationship that used to be. So it's quite a positive thing in a way, but probably a lot of people would not agree that we ever had a good relationship. But I think you would agree because I've just shown you what a good relationship we had, native and non-native, for hundreds of years. And when did it fall apart? I told you, 1924. For us, very specific day, we've never been the same. And who knows whether we will ever be able to reconstruct ourselves. But I'm going to close with this. The residential school. It's on the grounds of the Woodland Cultural Center, and it's been abandoned since it was closed in 1970. Not only was it the first residential school, but it was the last one to be open. So 1970, it's a long time ago now, it's 50 years. The building sat virtually vacant. It was occupied by a few people, offices and things, low rent. However, the building went into a gross state of deterioration, and the roof started falling in. So everyone got together and said, shall we tear it down? Which a lot of Native communities tear their residential school down today. Or shall we preserve it? Now, people at Six Nations are very savvy. They know that that school, what that school represents, is a piece of architecture. It's a very stately building. I've shown you pictures of it. It has a lot of bad memories in it, but it's a very dignified neoclassic building designed in Ottawa. I had one of my students did a beautiful master's thesis about the architects of the residential schools across Canada. Groundbreaking work she did. She now works at the National Archives in Ottawa, and she's going to school at McGill. Brilliant woman. And that was the result of my class, that she decided to do that research. So it's one good thing that came out of the class, among others, I hope. But we decided to label the building a national site of cultural genocide. Oh, I said, okay, that's a great title. It's very scary. It reminds me of Auschwitz. But Bill, it was like Auschwitz. But it wasn't carried out at the same level as Auschwitz. But they ruined our children. And how many Nazis ruined children in the name of research? So, you know, we were kind of familiar with it. Quite interestingly, we have a lot of Jewish friends and allies at Six Nations who do recognize our genocides have similarities, and they want to work together with us, which I find crazy. You know, when you think of the way people on the earth are relating to each other now that the truth comes out. And this is where the word truth comes in. What is truth? What really happened? Well, how do we know what really happened? Bearing witness. That's all we know. That's all we know about the Holocaust is witness, witness, witness. And we have witnesses. So that is the grand picture of the relationship of Six Nations to the jurisdictions having authority around us. I'm calling it that because that's the big name for government, and it's a big name for Canada. They're jurisdictions having authority over us. Okay, thank you very much. Difficult as it is, we're going to be moving on now to the final two lectures are interesting because the next lecture is all about how anthropological museums around the world have collected our artifacts and objects for years, and who they are and what the collection looks like today. We are the most studied native culture in the world. So put it together. How could we be the most studied? Well, because the first anthropologists were, in fact, from Six Nations. Eli Parker with the Smithsonian Institution. I'll show this to you next week. And then the last lecture, which I'm still doing a little research on, but it's called The Unconscious Streaming of Indigeneity. So it's all about how we as architects unconsciously address native culture in the name of creativity without even knowing what we're doing. But when I give you the context and content of what native architecture is, I'm going to show you how to recognize it in the work of other architects, including myself. That sort of comes to us spontaneously as the creative act. Okay. That's it. A little preview of what's coming up in the last two lectures, and I will see you later.